Imagine paying for your son's dream wedding, and then his fiance's family publicly kicks you out of the ceremony. They thought they could use me, a frail old librarian, to pay for their lavish lifestyle while they secretly drained my bank account to save their bankrupt business. It was all a lie. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought they had won, but they forgot that my justice was found in the fine print. Looking back, the whole thing started in a room that smelled like lies and lilies. I was at the Hayes' house for what was supposed to be a final family get-together before the wedding. The air was so thick you could taste the tension, but everyone was smiling these big fake smiles. I was sitting in one of those stiff velvet armchairs that cost a fortune, but are terrible to actually sit in, just trying to look pleasant while my tea went cold. My son Ethan was there, of course, next to his fiancée Vanessa. He looked happy, I guess, but it was a surface-level happy. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the ones I knew better than my own. Vanessa's father, Mark, was putting on the biggest performance of all. He was pacing in front of this ridiculous marble fireplace they never used, acting like the proud father of the bride. He kept clapping Ethan on the back a little too hard, booming about how the whole city was talking about the wedding. He made sure to mention the hotel, the Benson, emphasizing how it was nothing but the best for his little girl. Ethan, bless his heart, tried to give me some credit. He pointed over to me and said that I was the one who made it all possible. For just a second, I saw something flash in Mark's eyes. It was cold and sharp, like a shard of glass. But then it was gone, buried under another big booming laugh as he agreed, of course, we were all so grateful to me. He said the words, but the way he said them, it was like he was thanking the hired help. That's how it had been for the last month. Their gratitude felt like a blanket they were trying to smother me with. Vanessa would call every single day, her voice just dripping with this fake concern, telling me I shouldn't be driving, and that she'd send a car, or not to worry my head about the payment schedules, because she and her daddy would handle all the logistics. They were building this pretty little cage around me, piece by piece, cutting me off from the very event I was paying for. And they did it all in the name of protecting my health. Even my neighbors couldn't get through. If they dropped by, they were told I was resting. If I tried to call the wedding planner myself, Vanessa would somehow always intercept, promising she'd pass along the message. But the real knife in the back was quieter. Last week, Mark had shown up at my little house in Laurelhurst, carrying a whole stack of papers. He spread them out on my dining room table, going on about how they were just final vendor forms, standard stuff for a big event. He smelled of expensive cologne, but underneath it, I could smell the desperation. He talked fast, and somewhere in the middle of that stack between a form for the florist and another for the caterer was a document with a very official-sounding title, Family Asset Management Mandate. He just breezed right over it, telling me it was a formality, really. Just something to give them authority to handle any payment issues so I wouldn't be bothered. I was so tired of fighting of the constant pressure. And more than anything, I just wanted to believe that my son was happy. So I signed it. I, a retired librarian who built a life on order and facts, and always reading the fine print, I didn't read the fine print. So back at their house as the party was ending, Vanessa walked me to the door. She put her hand on my arm, her nails perfectly done, and told me I looked tired. She suggested I head home while she and Ethan stayed to finish the seating chart with her daddy. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a dismissal. Another gentle push back into my cage. As I walked to my car, I was fumbling for my keys, and I dropped them right into a bush of these big white hydrangeas. I had to kneel down to get them, and for a moment, I was completely hidden by the leaves. That's when I heard his voice coming from the study window, which was cracked open just a little. It wasn't the loud, cheerful Mark from the party. This was a low, panicked hiss. He was on the phone, talking fast, saying the wire transfer from my account hadn't cleared the final hold. He told the person on the other end he couldn't ask me about it directly because I thought the mandate was just a formality. Then came the words that stopped my heart. He said the hotel needed $50,000 by the next day, or they'd cancel everything, and if that happened, a whole deal with some investors would collapse. He kept repeating the deadline. Friday. They had until Friday, or they were ruined. I just stayed there, kneeling in the dirt, the cold metal of my keys digging into my palm. Ruined. The word just hung there in the perfectly manicured garden. It was never about a wedding. It was about a deadline. And I finally understood. I wasn't the loving matriarch funding her son's happiness. I was the mark. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. I drove home from their house that night in a strange sort of calm. The shock was still there, of course, a cold stone in the pit of my stomach. But it wasn't panic. When I woke up the next morning, that feeling had settled into a kind of cold, clear purpose. The librarian in me just took over. You see, when you spend your life organizing information, you learn that the best way to solve a problem isn't with a big emotional confrontation. It's with data. This whole conspiracy was a puzzle, and from what I'd overheard, they were amateurs. Their desperation was their weak link, and I decided right then that I was going to pull on that thread until the whole thing unraveled. My first move was to make a phone call. Not to Mark or Vanessa, they were on high alert. I decided to call Mark's wife, Catherine. She's one of those women who seems to float through life on a cloud of inherited money and blissful ignorance, more worried about the guest list for her next garden party than the details of her husband's business. I knew she wasn't a mastermind in the plot, but she was certainly enjoying the benefits, which made her the perfect person to probe. I deliberately pitched my voice to sound frail and a little confused, playing the part they'd already cast me in. I told her I was going over my bank statements and saw a big transfer getting ready to go through. I acted like I couldn't find my paperwork and had forgotten the exact final amount for the hotel catering, asking if she happened to know it. There was a long pause, and then she started stammering, saying she didn't handle that side of things, that Mark was the one who was meticulous with the numbers. I gently push, telling her I thought I'd heard Mark mention $50,000 for the hotel and asked if that sounded right to her. The sharp little gasp she took on the other end of the line was all the confirmation I needed. She quickly said no, $50,000 was for the florist, for some custom arches her husband had been adamant about. And there it was. Bingo. A direct contradiction. The money wasn't for the hotel at all. They were moving it around to cover other things they obviously couldn't afford, and were hoping that little asset mandate would keep me from seeing the details. I just sweetly told her it must have been my mistake and thanked her for her help. It didn't even take an hour for the blowback to come. My phone rang, and it was Vanessa. Her voice was tight, wrapped in that fake calm she does so well. She said she heard I'd spoken to her mother and that I mustn't worry my head about the numbers. She assured me her daddy had it all under control and that I should just rest up for the big day. The message couldn't have been clearer. Stay down, be quiet, and stop asking questions. Their panicked scramble to get their stories straight was so clumsy, it practically screamed their guilt. That was all I needed to make my next move. While they were busy trying to patch the leak I'd just created, I made a second call. This time, I didn't call a friend or a relative who might get emotional. I called Arthur Vance, my late husband's estate lawyer. Arthur is what you'd call Old Portland. He's a man who values loyalty and discretion above all else, and he understands the quiet, unshakable power of a legally sound document. I kept my voice firm and clear. I told him I needed to see him, that it was about the trust and a document I had been misled into signing. His response was immediate and serious. He just said to be at his office in 1 hour. After that call, the atmosphere changed. It was like they could sense I'd done something. I tried to phone the caterer myself to ask about a guest's food allergy, and I was told that all communications were now being routed directly through Mr. Hayes. Then a car showed up at my house, a driver Vanessa had sent to take me on a beau spa day. He waited at the curb for almost an hour, a polite but firm sentinel at my door. They were tightening the cage. But it was too late. I had already passed a key through the bars. I had an ally now, and I knew this wasn't just about getting my money back anymore. This was about protecting myself from people whose desperation was making them dangerous. My meeting with Arthur was exactly what I expected: grim-focused and utterly professional. His office filled with dark wood, and the smell of old books was a fortress of quiet power. He looked at the document Mark had tricked me into signing, his brow furrowed. He confirmed my worst fears. It wasn't just a simple form. It was a limited but very real power of attorney. It was cleverly worded to look specific to the wedding, but it gave Mark control over the exact investment account I was using to fund the whole affair. Arthur described it as the work of a desperate man, an amateur but a dangerous one. His advice was classic. Portland classic, Arthur, don't have a big messy confrontation. Instead, he advised a strategic retreat. Let them think they've won. So that's what I did. That evening when Ethan called, I made sure my voice sounded weak, tired. I sighed into the phone and told him that Vanessa was right, that I'd been overdoing it and was just going to rest until the wedding. I said I would leave everything in their capable hands. The relief in my son's voice was a small, sharp pain in my heart. He's a good boy, but he was so caught in their web, so blinded by what he thought was love. For the Hayes family, my sudden surrender was a huge victory. They thought their little panic was over, that the frail old woman was back in her cage. And with that belief, they got arrogant. While they were busy finalizing the last-minute details of their fraudulent masterpiece, I was in my own basement, a place no one but me had been in for years. My late husband was a man who believed in preparing for rainy days, and he was a meticulous record keeper. I went to an old wall panel that I knew was a little loose, and behind it was his old safe. I hadn't opened it in a decade. Inside, among old property deeds and forgotten stock certificates, was a file folder neatly labeled Ethan's Future. And there it was. It was the original paperwork for the very trust I was funding the wedding with. But there was something else. Something I had completely forgotten about. My husband had insisted on a special springing clause. It stated that if there was ever documented proof of financial malfeasance or beneficiary endangerment, the sole irrevocable control of the entire trust would automatically transfer to a third party. And that third party was Arthur Vance. It was a dead man's switch. A failsafe my husband had put in place to protect our son from this exact situation. Meanwhile, though, I didn't know the specifics at the time, Mark Hayes was living in his own private hell. He'd sit alone in his big, gleaming office late at night, not working, but staring at a pile of letters stamped with "Final Notice" in big red letters. His high-end construction business had taken a huge, unrecoverable hit when a big condo project lost its funding. He had leveraged everything he owned personally, guaranteeing loans he had no way of repaying. A message would flash on his phone from a private lender, not a bank, telling him he had 48 hours before the whispers started at the country club. And those whispers, he knew, would get louder. His shame was a physical thing, a weight pressing down on him. He'd look at a photo of Vanessa on his desk, her perfect smile, a symbol of both his love and his failure. That wedding wasn't just a solution for him, it was the only way he could see to save himself, to save his family. Back in my quiet house, I put on a performance of my own. I let the mail pile up. I canceled the newspaper delivery. And I had my neighbor tell the driver Vanessa kept sending that I was under the weather. But I wasn't resting. I was preparing. Over a secure phone line, Arthur guided me. I was assembling my case piece by piece, a copy of the deceptive mandate my phone records that showed their campaign to isolate me, and a notarized statement detailing Catherine's contradictory story about the $50,000. Their biggest mistake was seeing a sentimental old woman. They forgot they were dealing with a librarian. My whole life was built on organizing information, cross-referencing facts, and knowing that the real power is always hidden in the fine print. And I was about to expose all of theirs. Arthur and I decided the rehearsal dinner was the perfect time to strike. It was their final performance, the last moment they could bask in the glow of their fraudulent success. The dinner was at one of those painfully chic Portland restaurants with panoramic views of the Willamette River. I can just imagine them all dressed up, arranging themselves into a perfect picture of a happy, wealthy family, completely unaware that their own personal earthquake was about to hit. It started at 6:30, right as they were probably raising their first champagne toast. The first tremor wasn't a loud noise or a scene. It was the quiet, undeniable presence of Arthur Vance. He walked into their private dining room without being announced, his dark tailored suit, a stark contrast to all their celebratory clothes. He looked like a specter of sober reality who had just wandered into their fantasy world. He walked straight up to Mark Hayes, who was holding a glass of champagne, and presented him with a crisp, white envelope. Arthur's voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made the whole room go quiet. He introduced himself as counsel for me and for the Crawford Family Trust, and he informed Mark that he had been served. Mark went pale, his glass frozen in midair. Vanessa rushed to her father's side, demanding to know who Arthur was protesting, that it was a private event. That was my cue. I stepped into the room from behind Arthur, and I made sure I was everything they no longer expected me to be. I wasn't the frail, confused old woman they had so carefully managed. I was wearing a simple, elegant navy dress. My back was straight, and my gaze was steady. I felt the power in the room shift the second they saw me. Mark ripped open the envelope. I knew it wasn't a lawsuit. It was something much worse. Inside was a copy of that family asset management mandate, but this one was stamped with the words null and void in bright red ink. There was a second document, too, an immediate injunction freezing the wedding account, an action taken under the trust's own protective clause against financial malfeasance. Mark started blustering his face, turning a blotchy red, insisting it was all a ridiculous misunderstanding. Arthur didn't raise his voice. He just calmly countered, asking if it was really a misunderstanding. Then he produced another document, a sworn statement from our bank manager detailing Mark's frantic attempts to wire large sums of my money directly into his failing business's accounts. Arthur finished by asking him if that perhaps constituted fraud. That word fraud just hung in the air. It was sharp and ugly, and it shattered their entire performance. I watched Vanessa stare at her father, her perfect bride facade finally cracking as she asked him what Arthur was talking about. And that's when Mark just broke. All the pressure, the fear, the shame he'd been hiding for months, it all came pouring out. He sank into a chair, his face in his hands, and confessed everything. He choked out that the business was gone, that everything was gone. He admitted the bank was going to foreclose on their house on Monday morning, and that the private lenders were going to ruin them. He looked up, but his pleading eyes weren't looking at me. They were on his daughter. He told her this wedding was their only way out. It was all to save them, to save her. The confession landed like a bomb. His wife and the few other family members who were in on the plot just stared in shock, their own guilt now exposed. But my eyes were on my son. Ethan looked like he'd been physically hit. His face was a mask of utter confusion and betrayal. He looked from his weeping fiancée to her crumbling father, and then he looked at me, his mother, the only person in the room who wasn't falling apart, the one who was for the first time completely in control. I let the silence hang for a moment, and then I spoke. My voice was even, and it left no room for argument. I stated that the wedding, as they had planned it, was over. The funds were frozen. I told them that Mr. Vance would be handling all the vendor contracts that had been signed under fraudulent pretenses. I looked directly at Mark, then Vanessa, and then my stunned son. I informed them that we would be having a meeting the next morning at 10 o'clock in Mr. Vance's office. There, and only there, we would discuss what happened next. Then I turned and walked out with Arthur right behind me. I didn't look back. I just left them there in the wreckage of all their lies, powerless and terrified of the consequences they had brought upon themselves. The next morning, when we all gathered in the conference room at Arthur's office, the air was heavy and silent. The room had these grand windows that looked out over the whole Portland skyline, and it felt like the entire city was sitting in judgment of the Hayes family. Mark, Vanessa, and Catherine sat huddled together on one side of the long, polished table. They looked small, crumpled, and utterly defeated. My son Ethan sat right beside me. His face was pale and grim, and I could see that the trust he had so freely given to his new family was completely shattered. This was the real reckoning. It wasn't going to be a screaming match in front of hundreds of wedding guests. This was something colder, quieter, and far more devastating. This was the systematic dismantling of their lies in front of the only people who mattered now. I was the one who started. I made sure my voice was even and measured without a trace of anger. I told them we needed to be perfectly clear about what had happened. This wasn't some simple misunderstanding. It was a calculated, deliberate scheme to defraud a trust and to exploit my son's love for their daughter. Then, with the precision of a librarian cataloging a rare book, I laid out all the evidence. I started with the deceptive power of attorney document. Then I presented a timeline of their suffocating care, complete with the phone records to prove their campaign to isolate me. Finally, I showed them the bank statements, the ones that detailed Mark's frantic failed attempts to transfer my money. Every time Mark started to bluster or make an excuse, Arthur would just quietly slide another piece of irrefutable proof across the table toward him. But the true punishment, the one that really hit them where they lived, didn't come from me. It came from a third person Arthur had asked to join us. His name was Mr. Abernathy, and he was not only the senior loan officer from their community bank, but also a deacon at their church. He was a man whose good opinion was everything in their social circle. He sat at the head of the table, and as I presented the evidence, I watched his expression shift from deep concern to profound disappointment. When I was finished, he spoke, and his voice was heavy with sorrow. He looked at Mark and told him that he had known their family for 20 years. He said that to hear this, to see this proof, was a terrible shock, and that he would have no choice but to notify the church board. That was the blow that finally broke them. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about their reputation, their standing in the community. For people like them, the loss of face was a fate worse than bankruptcy. Catherine started to weep quietly into a handkerchief. Vanessa just stared down at her hands at the enormous engagement ring I had paid, for which now seemed to mock her. Finally, it was time for me to lay out the consequences. I told them first that the fraudulent document was officially rescinded and their access to any of my accounts was permanently terminated. Second, that Mr. Vance would be conducting a full audit, and any money they had already spent would now be considered a personal debt that Mark Hayes owed to the trust. A payment plan, I assured them, would be arranged. I paused to let that sink in. Then I looked at Ethan, who gave me a firm, solemn nod. I told them that third and finally the wedding was, of course, canceled. Ethan would not be entering into a marriage that had been built on a financial rescue scheme. Vanessa looked up, her eyes flashing with one last spark of defiance. She insisted that I couldn't do this, that she and Ethan loved each other. I just looked at her calmly and stated that love doesn't involve using another person as a shield against your own ruin. My justice wasn't cruel. I wasn't suing them into oblivion or calling the police. I was simply taking back what was mine and drawing a line that could never be crossed again. The consequences they were about to face, the social ruin, the debt, the loss of all trust, were entirely of their own making. I was just the mirror showing them what they had done. The real judgment wouldn't come from me. It would come from the community they had tried so desperately to deceive. In the weeks that followed that meeting, the collapse of the Hayes family wasn't a loud explosion. It was a quiet, devastating landslide. You know how things are in Portland. Nobody ever yells or confronts you directly. Instead, the punishment comes in the form of silence. The discreet rumors that I'm sure bled out from Mr. Abernathy's church board were incredibly effective. Suddenly, contracts for Mark's business were being mysteriously canceled. Invitations to the social events that were their entire world just stopped arriving. They were exiled not with shouts, but with a cold, polite silence that was probably far worse. They each handled it differently. Mark, stripped of his pride, and the facade he'd spent a lifetime building, just fell apart. He sank into a deep depression and was eventually forced to sell that big, ostentatious house and declare the bankruptcy he had fought so hard to avoid. He was a broken man, but in that brokenness, there was a tiny flicker of accountability. About a month after the meeting, a small handwritten letter arrived for me and Ethan. It contained only 2 words, "I'm sorry." It wasn't much, but it felt like a start. Vanessa, on the other hand, was a different story. She remained bitter, defiant, and completely in denial. In her mind, she was the real victim. She blamed me, she blamed Ethan. She blamed what she called the small-minded society of Portland for her downfall. She was completely unable to see her own role in the whole deception. Within a month, she was gone. She packed up and left town looking for a new city where no one knew her story, a place where she could invent herself all over again. As for Ethan, he was heartbroken, of course, but in a strange way, he was also liberated. The betrayal was a painful lesson, but it was a necessary one. It taught him the difference between affection and integrity. Through it all, he and I grew closer than we had been in years. Our relationship was rebuilt on a foundation of complete honesty and a new kind of mutual respect. He told me once that he finally saw the core of steel in me that he'd never recognized before. And I saw the resilient, honorable man my husband and I had always hoped we were raising. I, for my part, thrived. The money that would have been spent on that fraudulent, foolish wedding found a new and better purpose. I went to the main library downtown and established a small grant for underprivileged students in the city. It was a quiet legacy, but it felt more real and valuable than any lavish party ever could. I started having coffee again with old friends I'd been too tired to see. My days were filled with my book club walks in Laurelhurst Park, and the kind of authentic peace that only comes when you're living a life without pretense. The final scene of this whole saga for me took place about a year later. I was sitting on a park bench in the Portland Japanese garden with Ethan. It was autumn, and the maple leaves were this incredible mix of gold and crimson. He was telling me about a new job he was really excited about, and there was just this comfortable ease between us. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything we had been through and survived. He looked over at me, and for the first time in a long time, his smile reached all the way to his eyes. He told me then that he finally understood something his dad used to always say. He said that his father believed the strongest trees have the deepest roots. I smiled and looked around at the ancient, steady maples in the garden. My roots were deep. They were grounded in a lifetime of quiet prudence, of integrity, and of love. The storm had come, and it had been a fierce one, but it had only proven how strong those roots really were. I hadn't sought revenge. I had sought justice. And in doing so, I had reclaimed not just my money, but my dignity, my son, and my own unshakable peace. The consequences the Hayes family faced were a lasting reality they had created for themselves. My freedom, however, was the one I had secured for my own. Teresa's story teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of true strength. It shows that the most powerful response to betrayal isn't always a loud and fiery confrontation, but often a quiet, calculated act of self-preservation. She understood the desperation that drove her family to act, yet she never excused the harm they caused. Her justice wasn't about causing pain, but about restoring balance and setting unbreakable boundaries. In the end, her journey reminds us that real power doesn't reside in anger, but in the calm, unshakable dignity of knowing one's own worth.